My name is Daria Panayotti. I work at the Contemporary Art Department of the State Hermitage Museum. I curated the exhibition Cecil Beaton Celebrating Celebrity, which is currently on view at the General Staff Building. It is the first large exhibition of Cecil Beaton's work in Russia, and it was made possible thanks to the support from the DLT department store and the Hermitage Foundation UK. Here at the Hermitage, photography and fashion photography is overshadowed by the great art. While fashion is ephemeral and ever-changing, art is preserved for eternity. In the 20th century, however, these hierarchies and boundaries shift and disappear, and Cecil Beaton is actively involved in these processes. He is a true philosopher of fashion. He reflects deeply on its laws. And the exhibition begins with a quote from Beaton: "The truly fashionable are beyond fashion." In Russia, this elaborate culture, as well as the whole plethora of ideas that cluster around such words as socialité and glitterati, is missing, or better, has been missing for a very long time. So we took this opportunity not only to introduce Cecil Beaton to Russian audience, but to discuss the history of celebrity culture as well. As a young artist, Cecil Beaton dreamt of entering the circle of glamorous, bright youth. He was a constant visitor of pompous parties, soirees, and balls. Here, the exhibition features his famous photograph of the silver soap suits, including the photographer's sister. This was the very end of the Roaring '20s. The fun was almost wiped out by the deep financial crisis and the Great Depression. And here is one of the greatest beauties of her time, Paula Gellibrand. This is Beaton's type of beauty: hazy look, thin, affected. His colleague, Irving Penn, writes about certain Beaton type of woman, that is, aristocratic, genteel, eccentric. One of Beaton's most scandalous and famous encounters of that time was Wallis Simpson, a famous love interest of Edward VIII, whom he chose instead of the crown. British press is traditionally harsh on the royal mistresses, and Wallis, unfortunately, was not very photogenic. Beaton was the one to help her with her public appearance. Starting in the 1930s, Beaton works actively for the Vogue magazine. At the exhibition, we show the inner workings of fashion: prints with Cecil's marks on them, proof prints, and even scrapbooks full of cutouts from newspapers, magazines, ads, and elsewhere. The most famous photograph in this selection is Model in White Panama by Susie, a surrealist fantasy, which is in the list of icons of fashion photography. And here is an image made in 1936, which I find very interesting: a certain critique of the industry. Models as marionettes are conformed to the master photographer, who makes them pose in unnatural and weird poses in the name of beauty. Apart from a short break in the late 1930s, Beaton shoots fashion during his whole career. It is his love and his passion. He is very wise and philosophical towards the revolutionary changes in fashion after the war. And when in the 1960s an androgynous, thin girl replaces a respectable lady as a fashion's gold standard, the process which, after the Vogue chief editor of the time, is called youthquake, he accepts that. With the beginning of the Second World War, the whole world enters the era of uncertainty, changes, and shock. Fashion and society photography is close to non-existent. At an early stage, British Vogue publishes a number of manifestos where fashion is praised as a symbol of optimism and vitality in the face of war hardship. Fashion can work with whatever is available. It is after the war that Cecil Beaton becomes a leading portrait photographer of the royal court. It is thanks to his iconic images of Elizabeth II that almost every British knows his name now. Today, we know Beaton, first of all, as a photographer. But he was also a costume and set designer. He was an avid ballet amateur and a fan of Sergei Diaghilev. He of course dreamt of working with Russian ballet, but he was only able to do so after Diaghilev's death. He met some of the most famous ballet dancers, many of whom were of Russian origin, such as Rudolf Nureyev, Galina Ulanova, Maya Plisetskaya. It is easier to name those whom he did not photograph than to list all his sitters. A chapter of the exhibition is dedicated to the most famous and most prominent personas whom he ever encountered with. Beaton was very sensitive, very recipient companion, and he left wonderful, insightful memoirs with literary portraits of his contemporaries. This chapter starts, however, with his self-portrait as Nadar, famous French society photographer of the 19th century. This is the tradition Beaton sees himself a part of. Katharine Hepburn, Greta Garbo, Beaton's passion. He even proposed Garbo, but she never said yes or no, which is the hardest. Later, Beaton had to end this relationship himself. Unlike his friends from the Roaring Twenties, who after the war feel that their time has passed, that they do not understand or accept the change in time, Beaton always keeps abreast of the latest trends. He makes friends among the youth of the swinging London and beyond, such as Lucian Freud, Twiggy, Mick Jagger, Truman Capote. He meets Andy Warhol and his superstars. He pays visits to Chanel, whom he was shy of in the 30s. Here she is standing on the stairs of her famous atelier at Rue Chambon. And another important encounter in his career is Audrey Hepburn. She's dressed in a gown designed by Beaton himself for the Hollywood movie My Fair Lady. It is a sartorial fantasy in the spirit of good old Victorian England, which charmed the world. The hats are especially famous. Beaton received Oscar for his work. It is the only photographer I know who is awarded both the highest democratic prize, so to say, the Oscar, and the highest aristocratic award. He is granted an honorary knighthood. Already his contemporaries recognize his impact on the history of photography. His career lasted more than 5 decades, and he created an incredible collection of wonderful portraits. In a sense, he became synonymous to the phenomenon he was part of, to the phenomenon of celebrity culture. Today we all make selfies, and we all play to the audience. And it is thus fascinating and important to look back at the history of this culture, and at those who created the laws we now all follow.